I found out on a Tuesday morning in November when I was 63 years old and had been living in my son's house for 14 months, and had during those 14 months been under the impression that I was living there by invitation and that the arrangement was a mutual one in which I contributed to the household in various ways and was present in my son's family life in the way that a retired widower can be present when the alternative is the specific aloneness of a large empty house from which the person who made it a home has been absent for 3 years. What I found was not dramatic in the way that certain discoveries are dramatic. There was no shouting and no scene. There was simply a printed document left on the kitchen table because my daughter-in-law Britta had gone to yoga at 7:30, and my son Tobias had left for the office at 8, and neither of them had cleared the table before leaving, and the document was there in the position where it had been placed the previous evening, after what had apparently been a significant conversation. A conversation that had been conducted in the kitchen while I was in my room at the back of the house reading, and that I had not heard. The document was a printout of an email from a legal firm in Frankfurt. It was addressed to Tobias, and it was about the apartment building in the Norden district that my wife Margaret and I had purchased in 2001, and that had been the primary investment property in our small portfolio for 22 years, and that was currently valued. As I knew from the annual assessment I commissioned each January at approximately 2.1 million euros. The email described the instruments available for the transfer of the property into a family partnership structure in which Tobias and Britta would be the managing partners, and I would hold a minority interest that was described in the email. With the specific, careful language of a legal professional, managing a sensitive situation as a participation commensurate with the expected remaining duration of the founding partners' involvement. The expected remaining duration of the founding partners' involvement. I am 63 years old, and I read this phrase twice, and then I put the document down on the table, and I made myself a cup of coffee, and I drank it at the window. The view from the kitchen window in Frankfurt was the street which in the Norden district is a specific kind of Frankfurt street, lined with the large residential buildings of the late 19th century that survived the Allied bombing by the accident of geography, and that contain within their thick masonry walls the accumulated domestic history of a city that has been rebuilt several times, and that carries its history less visibly than other German cities, but no less completely. It was November, and the trees had completed their decision about the autumn, and the street had the quality that streets have in November, the quality of being fully itself, without the overlay of other seasons. I stood at the window for approximately 15 minutes. Then I went to my room and I called my lawyer. My name is Klaus Richter. I am 63 years old. I was born in Stuttgart in 1961, the son of a mechanical engineer and a pharmacist, which is a combination of parents that produces in the children. It generates a specific relationship with precision and with the specific kind of intelligence that is most useful when applied to systems that need to work correctly, rather than to problems that require creative solutions. I am not a creative person in the artistic sense. I am a systematic person in the engineering sense. And this quality has organized my professional and personal life in ways that have been both limiting and useful, and the limitation and the usefulness have not always been easy to separate. I studied mechanical engineering in Stuttgart, and then completed a doctoral thesis on thermal management systems for industrial processes at the Technical University of Munich in 1990. I joined a company in Frankfurt that manufactured specialized industrial equipment for the chemical processing sector, worked there for 6 years, and left in 1996 to found my own consulting firm, Richter Thermal Technik, which provided engineering analysis and process optimization services to industrial clients across Germany and the German-speaking region. The firm grew over the following 26 years into a company of 19 people with a client roster that included several large chemical companies and a number of specialized manufacturers whose processes required the kind of close technical engagement that the large engineering consultancies could not provide with the same specificity. I sold Richter Thermal Technic in 2021 to a consortium of which two of my senior engineers were part in a transaction that had been structured over 3 years with the assistance of my lawyer and my accountant, and that produced after taxes and transaction costs a sum that I will not specify here, except to say that it was sufficient to constitute financial independence for the remainder of my life, under any reasonable projection of how long that remainder might be. The sale also produced the specific condition that I was not entirely prepared for, which is the condition of not having work to do in the particular form that work had taken for 25 years. Margaret died in November 2020. She had been ill since 2018, and she had managed the illness with the specific combination of practical intelligence and emotional honesty that characterized everything she did. And she died in the autumn of the second year of the pandemic, in the bedroom of our house in the Norden district with the appropriate people present. She was 61 years old, and she had been the person around whom my life had organized itself for 34 years, and her absence was the largest structural fact of the following years, including the 14 months in Tobias's house, which I had accepted partly because the arrangement seemed useful, and partly because the house in the Nordend was full of Margaret in a way that was both the reason to stay in it and the reason leaving felt necessary. Tobias was our only child. He was 36 years old, and he was a product manager at a technology company in Frankfurt, and he was in the ordinary sense in which we use the word a good man. He was considerate in the way that people who have been raised by considerate people tend to be considerate automatically and without particular thought. He was loyal to his relationships, to his friends, to his colleagues, to the family. He was competent at his work, which he had chosen on his own terms and which he pursued without complaint. He was in all these dimensions the person I had hoped he would become, and I had no particular grievance with the person he was. The grievance I had was with a single decision, and the decision was one that had a specific context that I needed to understand before I could decide what the decision said about the man who had made it. The context was Britta. Britta Schreiber had married Tobias in 2018, and she was 34 years old, and she was a marketing director at a pharmaceutical company, and she was in my professional assessment of her, which I am aware is not the assessment a father-in-law is expected to make, competent and strategic, in a way that served her professional objectives, and that she had extended with the same competence to the management of her marriage and her household. I do not say this with contempt. I say it as description. Britta organized her life with the same efficiency that I had organized mine, and the efficiency was real, and the organization was real, and the outcomes it produced were real. What the efficiency had also produced. In the 4 years of the marriage and the 14 months of the household arrangement was a specific assessment of my situation and resources that had apparently generated the email from the Frankfurt legal firm. I want to be precise about what the email contained, because the precision is important for understanding what I decided to do about it. The email did not propose anything illegal. The family partnership structure it described was a legitimate instrument under German law frequently used for the management of family assets and the optimization of tax liabilities on inheritance, and there were versions of this structure that would have been entirely reasonable to discuss with me openly, and that might, in other circumstances, have represented a sensible approach to the eventual management of the apartment building. The problem was not the instrument. The problem was the email's framing, which was the framing of a decision already under discussion between Tobias and Britta and their legal advisor, a discussion from which I was absent, and in which I was described not as a participant but as a parameter. The founding partner. The expected remaining duration of the founding partner's involvement. I had not been consulted. I had not been informed. I had been in the house for 14 months eating dinner at their table 3 evenings a week and paying a sum each month into the household account that Britta had suggested was my contribution to the running costs. And during those 14 months, a legal process had been initiated that proposed to reorganize the ownership of a property I had owned for 22 years without asking me whether I wished to reorganize it. I called my lawyer at 9 in the morning. Her name was Dr. Petra Wald, and she had been handling my legal and financial affairs since 2008, and she understood the full structure of my situation with the precision of someone who had been inside it for 15 years. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had found. She was quiet for approximately 5 seconds. Then she said, "Klaus, I need you to be very clear about one thing." I said, "Yes." She said, "Does Tobias know you found this?" I said, "No." She said, "Good." She said, "Do not indicate to either of them that you found it." I said, "I understand." She said, "Can you come to the office today?" I said, "I can come at 2. She said, 2 is perfect. We worked for 3 hours at Petra's office. She had in the previous years, in the context of the estate planning we had done after Margaret's death, prepared the foundations of what she now helped me complete, which was a restructuring of my assets that was both legally straightforward and, once implemented, resistant to the kind of instrument the Frankfurt legal firm had been describing. The apartment building in the Nordend was transferred to a charitable foundation whose purpose was the support of technical education for students from working-class backgrounds, which was a purpose I had been thinking about for some years, and that I had been meaning to formalize, and that the Tuesday morning discovery gave me the specific motivation to formalize immediately. My other financial holdings were organized in a manner that Petra described with the specific dry humor of someone who has managed many such situations as having appropriate load-bearing characteristics. She said at the end of the 3 hours, "Klaus, how are you?" I said, "I am fine." She said, "You were in that house for 14 months. I said, "Yes." She said, "That is difficult regardless of what the legal situation is." I said, "Yes." She said, "When are you going to leave?" I said, "I need to find somewhere to go first." She said, "How long will that take?" I said, "A week." She said, "Take your time." She said, "But not too much time." I said, "No." I spent the following week in the specific state of organized action that I have always found most reliable in difficult situations, which is the state in which you move through a set of necessary tasks with the focused quality of someone who is attending entirely to what is immediately required and is not spending energy on what cannot be addressed yet. I looked at apartments. I found one that was available immediately, and that was on the Eschenheimer Anlage, in a building of the same period as the Norden buildings, with the same thick walls and the same quality of light in the mornings, and that was sufficient in all the ways that I needed it to be sufficient. I paid the deposit and arranged the lease. I packed. I had not brought many things with me when I moved into Tobias's house, because the Norden house still existed and still contained the accumulated domestic weight of 34 years of life. With Margaret and I had been living in Tobias's house lightly, in the way of someone who is not certain of the permanence of the arrangement and who has kept their roots in the place they came from. What I had brought fit into 4 boxes and 2 suitcases, and packing it took 3 evenings of the week. On the Friday of the week, I wrote a note. I had thought carefully about the note during the week about what it should say and what it should not say, and what level of directness was appropriate and useful. I had concluded that the appropriate level was the same level I had always used in professional communications, which is the level of complete accuracy delivered without embellishment. The note said the following: Tobias, I found the email from the Frankfurt legal firm on Tuesday morning. I have made arrangements that supersede the proposal. It described arrangements that Petra has implemented and that will be formally communicated to you next week. I am moving to an apartment on the Eschenheimer Anlage today. The Nordend house will remain in my possession until the estate matter is resolved, at which point the arrangements that Petra has implemented will determine its disposition. I am not angry with you. I want to say that clearly because what I have described above might suggest otherwise, and the suggestion would be inaccurate. I am addressing a situation that required addressing. I am doing this in the way I address situations, which is directly and without unnecessary delay. I would like to continue to have a relationship with you. I think that relationship will be better conducted from a clearer foundation than the one we have been operating on for the past 14 months. Klaus. I left the note on the kitchen table in the position where the legal document had been, and I loaded the 4 boxes and 2 suitcases into my car. And I drove to the Eschenheimer Anlage, and I moved into the apartment on a Friday afternoon in November, exactly 1 week after I had found the email on the kitchen table. The apartment was on the 4th floor, and it looked east over the park, and the November trees in the park were completing their transition, and the light through the window in the mornings had the specific quality of autumn in Frankfurt, the quality that is not beautiful in the conventional sense, but that is honest in the way of things that are exactly what they are without modification. I liked it immediately. Not because it was a pleasant apartment, though it was, but because it was mine, in a specific and unambiguous sense, in the sense of being a space I had chosen and that contained nothing that was not something I had put there and for reasons I understood. Tobias called on the Saturday morning. I let it ring twice before answering, because I wanted to be exactly prepared for the conversation, rather than catching it at the moment of its arrival. I said yes. He said Papa. He said it in the register of a person who has been sitting with something heavy since the previous evening, and who is not certain of the right way to begin. I said yes. He said, I read the note. I said yes. He said it was. He stopped. He said the email. I said yes. He said I should have told you about it. I said yes. He said we were discussing it. Britta thought. He stopped. He said I was involved in the discussion. I know that. I said yes, I know that too. He said, is there any way to... He stopped. He said, is there anything I can say? I said, there is always something you can say. The question is whether it is the right thing. He said, I am sorry. I said, I know you are. He said, is that enough? I said, it is where we start. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, can I come? I said, not today. He said, when? I said, next week. He said, Wednesday. I said, Wednesday is fine. He came on Wednesday at 7 in the evening with a bottle of wine that he had selected carefully, the kind of wine he knew I liked, which is a small thing, and also not a small thing. We sat at the kitchen table of the new apartment with the wine between us and the park outside the window in the dark, and the conversation was the conversation that it needed to be. It was not easy. Ease in these conversations is the enemy of honesty, and honesty was what I needed the conversation to produce. He told me about the months of discussion with Britta. He told me how the discussion had developed, and what the framing had been, and how the framing had felt to him as he was inside it. He was honest about his own participation, and honest about the degree to which Britta's framing had shaped his own thinking, and honest about the point at which he had understood that the framing was not something he was comfortable with, but had continued with it anyway. The last honesty was the hardest and the most important, and I respected it. I told him about the week between Tuesday and Friday. I told him about the conversation with Petra, and about the foundation, and about the apartment, and about the note. I told him the things I had thought during the week. including the things that were difficult to say, including the specific quality of sitting in the house for 14 months while this discussion was occurring without my knowledge. I told him what I had understood about myself during the week, which was that I had been in that house partly out of genuine familial feeling, and partly out of a specific version of the grief that follows losing someone after 34 years. A grief that reaches for presence and warmth, and that does not always examine the conditions of what it is reaching for with appropriate care. I told him I was responsible for the choices I had made, and that I was not assigning responsibility for the arrangement to anyone but myself. He said, "That is generous." I said, "It is accurate." He said, "You keep saying that." I said, "It keeps being true." He said, "Papa, the foundation. The apartment building? The Nordend?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That was always?" He stopped. He said, "I was expecting to inherit it." I said, "I know." He said, "Is that wrong?" I said, "It is a natural expectation. The question is what you do with the expectation." He said, "We were trying to ensure it." I said, "You were trying to ensure it without my participation." He said, "Yes." I said, "The foundation is what I decided to do with it." He said, "Yes." He was quiet. He said, "What does the foundation do?" I told him. He listened. He said, "Tobias." He said, "Sorry." I said, "Tobias." He looked up. I said, "That was not a slip. I was using your name intentionally." He said, "Yes." I said, "You are the kind of person who would have valued what the foundation does if you had encountered it at 21. He said, "I do not know what you mean." I said, "You would have valued it if you had been on the other side of it." He said, "I had everything I needed." I said, "Yes, you did. I made sure of that." He said, "And you think that was a mistake?" I thought about it. I said, "I think it was a choice that had consequences I did not fully anticipate." He was quiet. He said, "You mean me not knowing what things cost?" I said, "I mean you not knowing what some things cost." He said, "Yes." He said, "I think that is right." The foundation's announcement went out in December. Petra and I had worked with a communications consultant to draft the press release, which described the Klaus Richter Foundation for Technical Education, its initial endowment, and its purpose. The release was distributed to the relevant engineering and technical education press in Germany and received the specific response that such announcements receive when they are genuine rather than promotional, which is engagement from people who do useful work in the field and who are glad of the resources. 3 weeks after the release, I received an email from the head of the technical faculty at the university in Stuttgart, where I had studied 40 years earlier, which said I have been waiting for something like this for 20 years. I replied, "So have I." The first cohort of Foundation Fellows was announced in March. There were 5 of them from 4 German cities, ranging in age from 19 to 23, each selected on the basis of academic aptitude and financial need. I attended the announcement event at the Stuttgart faculty, in a lecture hall that had been renovated since I sat in it in the early 80s, and that now had the specific quality of a room that has been improved without losing its essential character, which is a quality I have always found the most satisfying kind of improvement in any built environment. The 5 students received their bursaries at the event, and they had the expression that I have tried to describe accurately every time I have tried to describe it, which is not the expression of someone who has received a gift, but of someone who has been shown that the door exists. Tobias was at the event. He had asked if he could come, and I had said yes. He sat in the row behind me, and he watched the 5 students receive their bursaries, and he did not say anything during the ceremony, and he came to me afterward, and he said, "I understand now." I said, "Yes." He said, "The door." I said, "Yes." He said, "You did this for them." I said. I did it because it was the right use of what I had built. He said yes. He was quiet. He said, Papa. I said yes. He said, I want to say something. I said, say it. He said, I have been thinking about what you said in November about not knowing what things cost. He said, I have been thinking about it since November. I said, yes. He said, I think you were right. He said, and I think I need to understand it better than I do. I said, yes. He said, how? I said, you start by paying attention to it. He said, to what? I said, to the cost. He said, I do not know what that means. I said, you will. I said, watch the 5 students for the next 2 years. He said, you want me to follow the foundation. I said, I want you to understand what the money does when it reaches the right person at the right time. He said, and then. I said, and then we will see what you understand. I am writing this in the apartment on the Eschenheimer Anlage on a June morning. The park outside the window has the quality of a Frankfurt park in early summer, which is the quality of a city that rebuilt itself after destruction, and that has made of the rebuilding something that is neither nostalgic for what was destroyed nor indifferent to it, but that is simply the functional, beautiful thing it is. I find this quality more and more satisfying as I get older, the quality of things that have survived difficulty and continued to function with integrity. It is the quality I am trying to produce in the remaining work of my life, which is the foundation and the occasional technical consulting and the teaching at Stuttgart and the relationship with my son that has been rebuilt from a more honest foundation than the one it had before November. The 5 fellows submitted their first quarterly reports in April. Reading them occupied 2 evenings of the April week, and the reading was, I want to say this precisely, the most satisfying reading I have done since the technical papers I read in my doctoral years when the engineering was new and the possibilities were large. The reports described what they were learning, and what they were finding difficult, and what they were beginning to understand. And the descriptions had the quality of people who are encountering their own aptitude for the first time in a supported environment, and who are naming the encounter as accurately as they can. I wrote back to each of them. I gave them the specific feedback that their reports deserved, and I asked the questions that their reports raised. 2 of them have already replied with responses that produced in me the specific feeling that Mevru de Kock must have felt when she saw the 15-year-old bricklayer's son in the mathematics class and understood what she was looking at. Tobias met 2 of the fellows at an event in May. He called me the following morning. He said, Papa. I said, yes. He said, the young man from Leipzig. I said, yes. He said, he is 20 years old and he is doing what I was doing at 20 but without the things I had. I said, yes. He said, I did not understand that until I met him. I said, no. He said, I am sorry it took this long. I said, it took the time it took. He said, was it worth it? I said, ask me in 10 years. He said, I am asking now. I said, yes, it was worth it. Everything worth having takes the time it takes to become what it is. He said, that is very German. I said, I am very German. He laughed. The laugh had the quality that his mother's laughter had, a quality of being completely present in the moment that produces it, and I sat with it for a moment before saying anything else. I said, Tobias. He said, yes. I said, come for dinner on Saturday. He said, yes. I said, bring Britta. He was quiet for a moment. He said, are you sure? I said, yes. I said, not because I have resolved everything about November. I said, because the relationship is worth the effort of the conversation, and the conversation is what Saturday will be. He said, that is very honest. I said, yes. He said, we will come. My name is Klaus Richter. I am 63 years old, and I built a company for 25 years and sold it, and then spent 14 months in my son's house misreading the situation, and then found an email on a kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in November, and corrected the misreading with the same tools I have always used for correcting misreadings, which are legal precision and honest communication, and the specific willingness to act on accurate information without waiting for the action to be comfortable. The foundation is running. The 5 fellows are studying. The apartment on the Eschenheimer Anlage has the morning light I wanted. The park outside the window is doing what parks do in June, which is to be exactly themselves, full and green and specific to the city they are in, and the season they are in, and the morning they are in. Everything is as it should be. That is not a small thing. That is the thing. I want to say something about what the 14 months in Tobias's house were actually like, because the account so far has focused on the legal and the financial and the discovery, and the account would be incomplete without describing the daily texture of those months, which is where the real story of the arrangement lived. Tobias and Britta's house was a modern house in the West End district of Frankfurt, well-designed and well-maintained, with the specific qualities of a house inhabited by 2 professional people in their mid-30s who are competent at everything they undertake, and who approach the maintenance of their domestic life with the same strategic competence they bring to their professional lives. The house was clean and organized and comfortable, and it had the quality that well-organized houses have when they are inhabited by people who have decided exactly how they want to live and have implemented that decision thoroughly. I lived in the guest room, which was a large and comfortable room at the back of the house that looked out over the garden. The room had everything a guest room should have, and the hospitality was genuine in the sense that both Tobias and Britta were attentive to whether I had what I needed and responsive when I indicated that I needed something. The hospitality was also, I understood, gradually organized around the assumption that I was a guest, which is to say around the assumption that my presence was temporary and conditional, and managed rather than around the assumption that I was a family member who had come to live with family. This is a subtle distinction, and I want to make it precisely because the distinction matters for understanding why the email was not a surprise. A guest is managed. A guest's presence is accommodated. A guest's needs are attended to. A guest is in a well-run household comfortable. What a guest is not is a participant in the household's life in the full sense. A guest does not know what is being discussed in the kitchen when the guest is in the back room reading. A guest is not present at the conversations that constitute the household's actual operation, the conversations about finances and plans and the future and what the household is building toward. A guest is a parameter in those conversations, not a participant. I was a parameter in the conversations that produced the email from the Frankfurt legal firm. The discovery of the email was not a betrayal in the sense of a deliberate act of concealment. It was the consequence of a frame in which I had been placed, and in which I had allowed myself to be placed, the frame of the managed guest, rather than the fully present family member. And the consequence of that frame was that the conversation about my property had been conducted in rooms I was not in and had reached the point of legal consultation before I was aware it had been initiated. I was aware of this on the Tuesday morning when I found the document, and the awareness was one of the things I thought about while I was standing at the window with my coffee. The other thing I was aware of was that I had contributed to the frame. I had come to the house in grief and with the specific needs of someone in grief, which are the needs of presence and warmth and the continuation of daily life in a context that is not entirely solitary. And I had accepted the frame that was offered because the frame met those needs in the short term and because I had not examined what it would produce in the medium term. I am an engineer, and I have spent 30 years understanding that structures fail at the point where the design does not adequately account for the loads it will carry over time. And I had applied this understanding imperfectly to the domestic arrangement I had entered into. This reflection does not excuse the email. It contextualizes it. The contextualizing is important because without it, the response to the email would have been simply defensive rather than structural, and defensive responses to structural failures produce a repaired surface rather than a corrected structure. I wanted the corrected structure. I called Petra at 9 in the morning. I want to describe the foundation in more detail because the foundation is the thing I am most satisfied with in this account, and the description it deserves is more complete than the brief account I have given. The Werner Klaus Foundation for Technical Education had been in development in my mind for longer than the 14 months in Tobias's house, or even the years of thinking about what to do with the proceeds of the firm's sale. It had been in development since a specific evening in 2003, when Margaret and I had attended an event at the technical faculty in Stuttgart, a fundraising dinner for the faculty's scholarship fund, at which a young woman from a small town near Ulm received an award for the top grade of her graduating class. She was 23 years old, and she had grown up the daughter of a construction worker and a supermarket employee, neither of whom had attended university. And she had gone to Stuttgart on a federal scholarship that covered her tuition and a loan that covered her living costs, and she had graduated at the top of her class in mechanical engineering. She gave a short speech at the dinner. She said that she had not known this was possible until she was 17, and a teacher at her secondary school had told her it was possible and had helped her apply for the scholarship. She said I had no map for where I was going. I had never met anyone who had gone there. The scholarship was not just the money. It was someone telling me the door exists. I had thought about that speech many times in the 20 years since the dinner. I thought about my own path and about the teacher in Stuttgart who had organized the open day I attended at 15, and about what would have happened if I had not attended the open day, and about the specific topology of paths that lead to technical careers, which is a topology full of doors that are not visible unless someone tells you they are there, and that are not accessible unless someone provides the means to go through them. I had been told about the door. I had had the means. Not everyone had both. The foundation was what I decided to do about this. Petra and I had structured it over the 3 working days between Tuesday and Thursday of the week after finding the email. The structure was as follows. The apartment building on the Nordendanlage, valued at 2.1 million euros, transferred to the foundation as the initial endowment. The foundation's purpose: bursaries and mentoring for engineering students from financially limited backgrounds in partnership with 3 technical faculties in Germany. The governance: a board of 3 trustees, of whom I was one, and the other 2 were a former colleague from the firm and a professor from the Stuttgart faculty who had been involved in the scholarship program for 15 years and who was. When I called him to ask if he would serve on the board immediately and genuinely enthusiastic, the partnership agreements with the 3 faculties were signed in February, 2 months after the December announcement. The agreement specified the selection criteria, the bursary amounts, the mentoring commitments, and the reporting requirements. The selection process for the first cohort ran through January and February. The 5 fellows were announced in March at the Stuttgart event I have described. What I want to describe is the selection process, because the selection process was the part that I found most significant and that I think about most often when I think about what the foundation is doing. We had 43 applications for the 5 initial fellowships. 43 students from across Germany, each of whom had been identified by their faculty as meeting both the academic and the financial criteria, and each of whom had submitted a personal statement describing their background and their reasons for pursuing engineering and what the fellowship would mean for their continuation of that pursuit. I read every statement. I read them over 2 evenings at the apartment on the Eschenheimer Anlage with the park outside the window in the February dark. And the reading was one of the more significant experiences of my recent professional life. The statements had a quality that I had not expected, which is the quality of people who have been asked to describe something true about themselves and who have decided to do so with accuracy rather than with the strategic management of a professional application. They described specific difficulties and specific aspirations and specific moments at which the path became visible and specific moments at which it seemed to disappear. They described teachers who had opened doors and family members who had failed to understand the choice and financial pressures that had required practical solutions. The second job and the delayed semester and the years of working before studying. They described with the specific honesty of people who are asking for something they genuinely need rather than positioning for something they believe they deserve, why the fellowship mattered. I could not select 5 from 43 on the basis of the statements alone. Every one of them was a credible candidate, and the selection required the comparative judgment that Petra and the governance board provided, and the final 5 were selected by the board through a process that I will describe as rigorous and fair, because those are the accurate words. But reading the 43 statements was the experience that made the foundation real to me, in a way that the legal and financial structures had not, because the structures were the mechanism and the statements were the purpose, and understanding the purpose required reading the 43 people who represented it. The young man from Leipzig was 20 years old. He had grown up with a single mother who worked in a retail position and who had, by his account, done everything she could to support his education, and whose limitation was not will but resource. He had been in the top 5% of his secondary school class in mathematics and physics. He had spent 2 years after the Abitur working in a logistics company, saving money and paying off a debt his mother had taken on during his final school year when the household finances had been briefly overwhelmed. He had enrolled at the Leipzig Technical Faculty the previous autumn, and he had spent the winter on the edge of the decision about whether he could continue, because the combination of the tuition fees and the living costs and the textbooks and the professional society memberships that his advisor had told him were important and that he had not budgeted for was producing a monthly deficit that he had been covering from the savings, and that was running out. He wrote, "I am not asking for something I have not earned. I am asking for the means to continue earning it." He was one of the 5. He received his bursary at the Stuttgart event. He was, when I spoke to him afterward, exactly the person the statement had suggested. He was precise and he was direct, and he had the specific quality of someone who has been doing serious work for a long time without adequate support and who has maintained their standards in the absence of the support, which is a harder thing than maintaining standards with support, and which is the thing that produces the most reliable engineers. I told him when we spoke that I had read his statement. He said, "Thank you." He said, "I want you to know that the 2 years in logistics were not wasted years." I said, "I know." He said, "I learned how systems fail in practice." I said, "Yes." He said, "And I learned that I needed to understand the theory to understand the practice." I said, "That is exactly right." He said, "I will not waste the fellowship." I said, "I know that." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because you knew about the debt before I told you." He looked at me. I said, "The application said your mother took on a debt during your final school year. It did not say you paid it off." The statement assumed the reader would infer it. Most people would not have paid it off before enrolling. I said, "You did." He said, "Yes." I said, "That tells me what I need to know." He is in his 2nd semester now. The quarterly report from Leipzig came in April. His thermal systems examination result was 92%. His comment at the end of the report said, "Thank you. The door exists." The dinner with Tobias and Britta on Saturday was the conversation I had been thinking about since the Wednesday. I want to describe it because it was not a simple dinner and not a comfortable one, and because comfortable and simple are not the same as worthwhile, and the dinner was worthwhile. Britta came because Tobias asked her to, and she came with the specific quality of preparation that I had observed in her over the 4 years of the marriage. The quality of someone who has thought carefully about a difficult situation and has arrived at a position, and who will represent that position with competence. She was not defensive. She was in her own way honest, which is a quality I respected, even when the honesty was in the service of a position I found incomplete. She said at the beginning of the dinner, before we had finished the first glass of wine, "Klaus, I want to address the email directly." I said, "Good." She said the proposal was one that I thought was sensible from a financial planning perspective. I said, "Yes." She said I also thought it was something Tobias could raise with you when the time was right. I said, "But he had not raised it." She said, "We were still planning." I said, "For how long had you been planning?" She looked at the table for a moment. She said, "Since the previous spring." I said, "That is 7 months." She said, "Yes." I said, "During which I was living in your house." She said, "Yes." I said, "Britta, I want to tell you something." She looked at me. I said, "I do not doubt that the financial analysis behind the proposal was sound. The instrument is a legitimate one, and the reasoning behind it is defensible." I said, "What it was not was a conversation I was part of." She said, "We were preparing to have that conversation." I said, "You were preparing to present me with a proposal rather than to have a conversation. Those are different things." She said, "I understand the distinction." I said, "I know you do." She said, "I think I should have insisted we talk to you earlier." I said, "Yes." She said, "I think I was managing the situation rather than addressing it." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is not the right approach with you." I said, "It is not the right approach with most people." Tobias was quiet during this exchange. He said when there was a space for it, I should have told Britta that it needed to be a conversation. I said yes. He said I knew it did, and I did not say it. I said yes. He said, "I am sorry, Papa." I said, "I know." The dinner was not warm exactly. Warm was not what the occasion called for. It was honest, which is what the occasion called for, and the honesty was shared by 3 people who had decided that the situation required it, and who had each brought their capacity for it to the table. I left the dinner with the sense that the structure was more sound than it had been, which is not a romantic or a sentimental way to describe a family dinner, but is the accurate one, and accuracy is what I have. What happened with Britta over the following months is not the part of the story that is most important, but it is part of the honest account. She has a quality that I have come to understand better since the dinner, which is the quality of someone who applies strategic intelligence to situations that do not always benefit from strategic intelligence, and who knows this about herself and is working on the knowledge. She sent me a message in March, 2 days after the Foundation Fellows announcement, which said I read the press release. It is a very good use of the endowment. I replied, "Thank you." She replied, "I understand it better now." I replied, "Yes, I think that is the beginning." I want to return to the Foundation's announcement and to the specific response it produced, because the response was part of the story, and because the story requires it to be honest about what the announcement was for. I did not make the announcement to humiliate Tobias or to demonstrate to Britta what they had proposed to redirect. I made the announcement because the Foundation was the right use of the asset, and because the right time to establish the Foundation was when the asset was available and legally clear to use for the purpose, which was December. The timing of the announcement relative to the November discovery was a consequence rather than a strategy. The Foundation would have been established in December whether or not the email had been found in November, because the foundation had been the destination for the asset for longer than the email had been in existence. What the November discovery changed was not the foundation, but my understanding of why the foundation needed to be irrevocable. Petra had included irrevocability in the structure from the beginning as a standard provision. After November, I asked her to add a specific additional provision that documented the purpose and the terms in a way that was legally bulletproof. She did. The additional provision cost 1 day of legal work. It was worth it. The letter from the Stuttgart professor came in January. It was handwritten, which is unusual in professional correspondence, and which I took as an indication that he had considered the letter carefully. He said, "I have been in technical education for 30 years. I have seen many people build things, and I have seen very few people at your stage of life decide that the thing they built should go to the people who need it most rather than to the people who expect it." He said Margaret would be glad. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer in the study where I keep things I want to be able to find again. I have not opened that drawer in a month, but I know the letter is there, and knowing it is there is sufficient. The apartment on the Eschenheimer Anlage has been mine for 8 months now, and I have been making it mine in the specific way that a person makes a space theirs, which is by inhabiting it with genuine attention, rather than with the managed attention of someone occupying a temporary space. I have cooked meals here that I had not cooked since Margaret died, because they were meals she had liked and that had felt wrong to make for one person, and that feel different in a space that is organized around one person's preferences rather than around the compromise of shared space. I have arranged the books in the order I prefer, rather than the order that was convenient to people. I have organized the mornings in the way my mornings want to be organized, which is early and quiet, and with the coffee at the window, and whatever I am thinking about allowed to be what it is. The grief for Margaret is not finished. I do not expect it to finish in the sense of completing. What I expect is what I have observed, which is that it changes quality over time, becoming less the presence of an acute wound and more the specific weight of someone who has been gone long enough to have become part of the permanent structure of who I am, rather than a recent loss. She is in the apartment in the specific ways she was in everything I built after I met her, which is as the standard I am working toward, rather than as a person. I can ask for confirmation. I said something to Tobias at the dinner that I want to note here, because it is the thing I am most certain of in this account. I said, "The thing you do with what you have built matters more than the building." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I spent 26 years building the firm. The building was the work. The selling was the transition. The foundation is what the building was for." He said, "You did not know that when you were building." I said, "I knew the building was not the end. I did not know what the end was." He said, "And now you know." I said, "I know one version of it." He said, "Is it a good version?" I said, "Yes. I think it is the right version." My name is Klaus Richter. I am 63 years old. I was born in Stuttgart in 1961. And I built a technical consulting firm over 26 years, and I sold it, and then spent 14 months in my son's house, under an arrangement I had not examined carefully enough, and then found a document on a kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in November, and acted on the document with the tools I have always used for acting on information, which are legal precision and structural analysis, and the specific willingness to implement a decision once the decision is clear. I want to end this account with something that is not about the email or the foundation or the apartment or any of the specific events I have described. I want to end it with something about my father, because my father is in this story, even though he appears in it only obliquely, and the obliqueness is the thing I want to address. My father was born in 1930, and he grew up in Stuttgart in the specific conditions of the middle decades of the 20th century in Germany, which is to say in conditions of difficulty and reconstruction and the specific combination of shame and determination that characterizes a generation that has had to build its country twice. He did not go to university. He did not have the means or the context or the access to information that would have told him the door existed, because the door did not exist in the same form in the 1940s and 1950s that it existed when I was 15 and a teacher organized an open day for me. He worked in construction initially as a laborer and eventually as a foreman, and he managed the specific resources of a working-class family in a rebuilt city with the precision and care of someone for whom precision and care were survival requirements rather than professional virtues. He paid for my secondary education at a gymnasium that cost more than a state school, and that required him to make specific decisions about other things he would not buy in order to pay for it. I knew this at the time in the way that children know things about their family's financial situation without being explicitly told them. I did not know the specific numbers until after he died in 2009, and I reviewed his papers with my mother and found in a careful folder that he had labeled with my name and the years of my education a complete record of every payment made to the gymnasium over 7 years, every line item in the family budget that had been reduced to enable those payments, and a single note in his handwriting that said, "Worth every pfennig." I have thought about this folder many times since 2009. I thought about it when I was structuring the foundation. I thought about it when I was reading the 43 applications for the first cohort. I thought about it when the young man from Leipzig said, "I will not waste the fellowship," because what my father understood what the folder documented was the specific arithmetic of what it costs to give a person access to the thing they are capable of, and the specific understanding that the cost is not the point. The access is the point, and the only thing that makes the cost worth paying is that the person who receives the access uses it to become what they are capable of becoming. I do not know if the 5 fellows will become what they are capable of becoming. I believe they will on the basis of the statements they submitted and the quarterly reports they have provided and the specific quality of the conversation I had with the young man from Leipzig at the Stuttgart event. But belief is not knowledge, and the outcome is not in my control. And the foundation's job is not to guarantee outcomes, but to provide access. And the access is what my father's folder documented, and what the 30-year-old version of me received, and what I am now trying to provide to 5 people who need it. The park outside the window on the Eschenheimer Anlage is doing in June what it did in November when I moved in, which is being exactly itself. The November version was bare and specific in its bareness. The June version is full and specific in its fullness. Both versions are the same park doing the same thing, which is to be what it is in the season it is in completely and without modification. I find this satisfying. I find that I am in the apartment on the Eschenheimer Anlage at 63 years old in the June of the year after the Tuesday in November, at the beginning of something rather than at the end of something, which is a more interesting position than I had expected to find myself in at this point, and one I intend to inhabit with appropriate attention. The packet was a document on a kitchen table. The packet contained information about a plan being made about my property. The packet was delivered by accident rather than by design, and its delivery was the specific accident that turned a decision I had been forming into a decision I was going to act on. I acted on it correctly. The structure is sounder than it was. The door is open for 5 people who needed it open. The park is the park. That is enough. That is the full account. One more thing. I have been teaching at Stuttgart since September, 2 hours per week in the first semester, a session on process optimization for third-year mechanical engineering students. I mention this because the teaching is the part of my current life that connects most directly to what I have described, and that I want to include in the honest account. The students are 21 and 22 years old, and they come from everywhere that students in Stuttgart technical faculties come from, which is a range that includes the children of engineers and the children of people who have never met an engineer, and the range is not visible on their faces or in the quality of their questions. What is visible is the quality of their attention, which varies from student to student, and from session to session, and from subject to subject, and the variation is the most informative data available to a teacher about whether the teaching is reaching the student or passing over them. There is a student this semester, a young man named Bilal, whose attention has a quality I recognized on the first day of class from my own experience of being in a classroom where the material was the thing I had been waiting for. He sits in the second row. He does not take notes in the way that most students take notes, which is to write what I say while I say it. He thinks about what I say while I say it and writes his response to it, which is the note-taking of someone who is not recording information but processing it, and the distinction is fundamental to the difference between learning and understanding. I spoke to him after the fourth session. I asked about his background. He was the son of a Turkish immigrant family in the Swabian district of Stuttgart, a family that had been in Germany for 2 generations, and that had the specific combination of investment in education and limitation of resource that his father's and grandfather's immigrant generation had, which was the same combination that my father had in a different form in a different decade. He was studying on a state loan and a part-time income from evening work at a logistics company, a combination that was sustaining him, but that was leaving him with less time for the work than the work required. I told him about the foundation. I told him about the selection criteria and the bursary amounts and the mentoring program. He listened with the focused attention he brought to the process optimization lectures. When I finished, he said, "You are telling me this because you think I should apply." I said, "I am telling you this because you should know the door exists." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "That is an interesting thing to say." I said, "It is a thing that was said to me." He said, "By whom?" I said, "By a teacher." He said, "And it made a difference." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you want to pay it forward." I held this phrase, which is an Americanism, but a useful one. I said, "I want the door to be open to everyone who has earned the right to walk through it." He said, "I have earned it." I said, "Yes, I know you have." He said, "I will apply." I said, "Good." The application arrived at the Foundation's administrator in October. It was the strongest application we received for the second cohort. He received his fellowship in November. He sent me a message the day he received it that said, "Thank you for showing me the door." I replied, "The door was always there. You found it." The second cohort of Foundation Fellows is 5 again, from 5 cities, all in their first or second year of technical education, all on the specific trajectory that requires the right support at the right time to become what it can become. I have read every one of their quarterly reports. I have replied to each one with the specific feedback that the report deserves and the questions that the report raises. 2 of them have written back with responses that produce the specific feeling that I have come to understand as the confirmation that the thing is working. The thing is working. The park outside the window on the Eschenheimer Anlage is in November now completing its second autumn since I moved in. The November trees are the same trees they were last November, doing the same transition they did last November, with the same honesty about what the season requires of them. The mornings are the same mornings I have been having since September. Early and quiet, and with the coffee at the window, and the park in the specific quality of the November light. Everything is as it should be. My name is Klaus Richter. The firm was built and sold. The foundation is running. The apartment is mine. Tobias and I have dinner on the last Saturday of every month. My father's folder is in the drawer in the study, where I keep things I want to be able to find again. The door is open for 10 people who needed it open, 5 in the first cohort, and 5 in the second, and more to come. That is the honest account. That is everything. There is a thing I want to add that does not fit neatly into the sequence of events, but that belongs in the honest account, which is about the Nordend house. I sold the Nordend house in April, 8 months after moving to the Eschenheimer Anlage. The sale had been in progress since December because the house was large and specific and required the right buyer and the right process, and Dirk managed the sale with the same care he manages everything. And it concluded in April with a buyer who was a family with 3 children who had seen the house on a Saturday open day and who had the specific quality of people who are looking for a house to inhabit rather than an investment to manage. I went to the house one last time on the Friday before the sale was completed. I had not been back since the November day when I had loaded the 4 boxes and 2 suitcases into the car and driven away. I had the key from the agent, and I went in the late afternoon when the light was the specific Frankfurt late afternoon light that I associated with the house from 34 years of late afternoons in it. I went through the rooms. The furniture was gone because it had been cleared for the sale. The garden was maintained because Dirk had arranged for a garden service to maintain it. The rooms had the quality that rooms have when they have been lived in for a long time and are empty for the first time in a long time, which is the quality of presence of something that is no longer there, but that has left a specific character in the space, a warmth in the walls, and a quality of light in the windows, and a familiarity in the proportions of the rooms that is the accumulated result of 34 years of someone's life happening in them. I stood in Margaret's music room for about 10 minutes. The music room had been her specific room, the room she had taken for her piano when we moved into the house, and that had remained hers throughout the years. Not a room I entered often, but a room whose existence and whose sound through the walls had organized the acoustic of the house in the way that a key signature organizes a piece of music, present in everything without always being the thing you are listening to. The piano was gone. The room had the quality of the piano's absence in the specific way that rooms have the quality of the things that define them when those things are removed. I said Margaret, not to a ghost, to the room, to the specific accumulation of her in the space. Then I went to the kitchen and I made sure the water was off and the heating was set correctly for the handover, and I locked the door and I gave the key to the agent, and I drove to the Eschenheimer Anlage. The money from the sale went into the foundation's endowment as Dirk had structured it. The family with 3 children moved in May. I passed the house once in July on the way to a meeting in the Nordend, and the front door was open, and a bicycle was leaning against the front wall, and there was a sound from somewhere inside the house of children, or a television, or both, and the house had the quality of being used again in the full sense, which is the quality I had been hoping it would have. That is the last piece of the account. Everything else I have described stands as described. The door exists. The structure holds. The park is the park. I want to say one more thing, which is about the phrase in the email that I have thought about most often. The expected remaining duration of the founding partner's involvement. I am 63 years old. I was a founding partner in my firm for 26 years, and I sold it and the firm continued. I am the founding partner of my own life for 63 years, and I have not sold it and it is continuing. The expected remaining duration is not a parameter that I am going to attempt to calculate. because the calculation is not useful, and the accuracy is not achievable, and the time spent on the calculation is time taken from the life. The calculation is supposed to be predicting. What I can say about the remaining duration is this: the foundation is running and will continue to run after I am no longer able to run it, because Petra structured it correctly, and because the board includes people who understand the purpose and are committed to it. The students I am teaching in Stuttgart are receiving the teaching and will receive better teaching as I continue to improve, which is the normal trajectory of a teacher who pays sufficient attention. Tobias and I have dinner on the last Saturday of every month, and the dinners are improving in quality as the honest foundation becomes more established under the relationship. The apartment on the Eschenheimer Anlage is exactly what I need it to be for as long as I need it. The remaining duration, whatever it is, will be organized around these things. This is sufficient. It is more than sufficient. My name is Klaus Richter. The packet was a document on a kitchen table. The packet has been addressed. Everything that needed to be built has been built. Everything that is worth holding is being held. That is the full and accurate account. I have been thinking about what happened and what I made of it, and I think the honest summary is this. I spent 31 years building a life with Margaret, and 26 years building a firm, and 63 years building whatever it is that you build when you live with care and without waste, and with the consistent application of the specific capacities you were given. The email on the kitchen table in November was a signal that the building had been noticed by the wrong people in the wrong way. Signals of this kind require a response. I responded. The response was structural. The structure is sounder than it was. I am satisfied with the work. The founding partner's involvement continues. I want to note for completeness that Bilal's first semester examination results arrived in my faculty inbox in January. He was third in his cohort in process optimization with a grade of 89%. He sent me a separate message that said, "I think I understand now why systems fail at the point where the design does not account for the loads over time." I replied, "Good." He replied, "I think it applies beyond thermal systems." I replied, "Yes, it does." He replied, "Thank you for opening the door." I replied, "Thank you for walking through it." That is the last word. The door is open. People are walking through it. The work continues. I have been asked, in the months since November, by the few people who know the outline of what happened, whether I feel that I made the right decisions. The question usually implies a comparison. Was it better to leave than to stay? Was the foundation better than the inheritance? Was the apartment better than the house? These comparisons are the wrong frame. The decisions were not comparisons. They were responses to accurate information implemented with appropriate instruments in the right sequence at the right time. Whether they are better than the alternatives is a question that requires the alternatives to have existed, and the alternatives did not exist after November in any form that was acceptable to me. I made the decisions that were correct given the information I had. I am satisfied that they were correct. The satisfaction is not triumph and not relief. It is the specific satisfaction of someone who has assessed a structural situation accurately and responded with structural solutions and whose structure is holding the load it was designed to hold. Klaus Richter, founding partner. The involvement continues.